Great. Well, thanks so much for joining me. Really excited to talk to you more, Sarah, about your experience, about how young people are thinking about this moment right now. Would love if you could talk a little bit about yourself, why you care about democracy, uh, both from your time in Arizona and as a student at Johns Hopkins right now.
Yeah, so my name is, oh wow, my camera just switched. My name is Sarakanti Iyer. I've lived in Arizona for all of my life. Actually, in the most politically divided district in Arizona, we're split in even thirds between Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. I really got involved after the 2016 election because that's when my mom got involved. She started two grassroots organizations focused on civic engagement and public education, and honestly kind of dragged me into it. I don't think I had much of a choice in the matter. So from then on, I started attending protests. She educated me on all things democracy, and that's what really kickstarted what has become, I think, a lifelong passion for upholding our democracy and, I mean, encouraging people to participate in it. I did, when I was around 10 to 12, participate in several protests, including the Bread for Ed marches and press conferences for Save Our Schools Arizona. But the major work I've done has been in the later years of high school and in college, where I developed a statewide voter registration program in Arizona, registered 97% of students at my own high school to vote, worked on everything from student members on school boards to junior deputy registrars in Maricopa County to oh, I don't even know what else, encouraging students to speak at school boards. And in college, it's been a focus on getting people to really talk to each other in a way that promotes healthy dialogue. With Anise Swamanathon, I founded the Hopkins Political Union, which focuses on bringing together Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and everyone in between or outside to talk about their views on politics and what matters to them in a way that's healthy, but also kind of independent of the two-party scheme. Um, I think that one of the major problems in our democracy right now is that people are not talking to each other in a healthy way. They are not understanding each other's opinions. They're not making an effort to understand each other's opinions, in many cases. And I see the Hopkins Political Union as a way of building a bridge between the two divided sides of our democracy, um, at Hopkins.
Super helpful. I'm curious, growing up in Arizona, you talked about how divided it was. Were young people, yourself included, engaged in the type of dialogue you're talking about at that age? Were people not talking about politics? Were people mostly talking to their tribe? How did some of that occur when you were growing up in such a divided place?
I think mostly the latter. I think people were mostly talking to their tribe. I definitely didn't have the most standard experience in Arizona because I went to a performing arts school in the downtown area of Phoenix. So the students I was interacting with were, for the most part, extremely liberal, and I am not. So that was a very interesting experience for me. But there was definitely a culture of, I mean, I don't want to say cancel culture, but there was definitely a culture of shaming around beliefs. If you were not, I mean, liberal enough for the school, you would get, in a sense, put down. Your opinions would be, I mean, you would get labeled as maybe uneducated, and you would, in a sense, that did not happen to me, but for several conservative students in my school, it did happen. Because it was so divided, my school leans more into that culture than others. But I know that in other parts of Arizona, the culture is extremely different. At public schools, for example, there is a much greater ratio of conservative to liberal students, and therefore the culture looks a lot more different. Um, when I was doing my voter registration drives, I was talking to a teacher out in Chandler, and she was saying that her chapter of the high school Democrats could not actually register voters because there were so many conservative students on campus that the Democrats chapter was socially ostracized. And I think that's a common experience across Arizona, that in some schools, some high schools, that is, there's a dominant culture of one political party, and so students of a different political leaning are not accepted as much.
Um, how, I mean, talk a little bit more and I mean, how are you finding young people engaging in democracy work in politics now in Hopkins, in Arizona? And I guess part of that is do you see young people as a whole willing to engage across difference? Are they tuning out of democracy and politics? Like what I mean, I'd be curious to get your take, but also the general vibes that you're feeling amongst other young people. How are young people making sense of things right now?
I think that there's this misconception that young people really don't care because so many young people are kind of tuning out in that sense. Um, but I think the issue is that young people care so much, and we're not seeing that reflected in our politics. I mean, we are the generation with the most LGBTQ plus individuals. We are the generation that is the most diverse racially and ethnically. We're the generation that is comprised of people with immigrant parents, immigrant families, and of first generation immigrants. And for that reason, the policies that are being enacted right now affect us in a much greater measure than they might affect other generations. And even though they affect us so much, we're not seeing our voices necessarily reflected in that process. So I think we've become very, very cynical about that. And for that reason, we're not engaging as much with work and democracy. I think a lot of young people have kind of given up on the entire process and have stepped back in order to protect themselves from what they might see as inevitable failure. Maybe this isn't the perspective of a lot of young people. It's certainly not my perspective, but it's definitely a theme that I've seen within conversations in classes, even with majority political science or humanities majors, and certainly in conversations with people who are looking in studies outside of the social sciences and humanities.
So what do you say? I mean, if you're talking to either peers and young people that say, look, politics is broken, doesn't matter who's in charge, it doesn't work for us. We want to think about other ways to engage, that sort of disillusionment. Like, what do you say to those people, young people? What would you say to those young people?
This is actually something I encountered a lot when I was doing, street corner form voter registration in Arizona. I mentioned a little bit about high school voter registration, but also during the summer, before I started college at Hopkins, I worked three different jobs, and one of them was standing on a street corner with voter registration forms and yelling at random people to register to vote. And what I got a lot was, oh, I don't want to register. I don't believe that voting works. I don't think my voice does anything. I'm just one person. What can I do? And what I would always ask those people was to name one thing that they cared about. I had this really memorable conversation with a man on Mill Avenue who said that he cared a lot about his daughter and he wanted to make sure that she was safe. So I talked with him about how him voting could have an effect on how policing works in neighborhoods, on the kind of public safety measures you get in your neighborhoods, how public service officials work with members of the community. And especially in Arizona, one of the major points that I bring out is that elections here are so close. I mean, we were talking a little bit earlier about Chris May's. Her election was actually decided by 380 votes, and this is a statewide election. The election in Arizona in 2020, the presidential, was decided by a margin of 10,000 votes. And this might not work across the nation because margins are a little bit larger in some states, especially, California, New Jersey, New York. Um, but I think the major message is that one voice can make a whole lot of difference. And it may not feel like it right now, but that's what everyone is thinking. And if you take the courage to stand up and work for what you believe in, you might see a lot more difference than you might think you will. You just need to have the courage to speak up and work for what you believe in.
Do you think that there's something to be learned, especially amongst young people that are frustrated, potentially impatient at the pace of change that comes from government, to the fact that the Trump administration has changed things quickly, irrespective of whether you agree with that change? But is there something to be? I'm trying to sort of piece together what you were saying about young people being frustrated that things aren't changing. Is there something to be gleaned from the fact that things have changed in ways that we might not have thought of as possible?
Yeah, I think that you pointed out one of the the major characteristics of how young people are engaging in politics right now, I think we want things to change quickly. No matter which way they're changing, I think we want them to change right now. I mean, I think young people to a certain extent have always been focused on the immediacy of change, which is not something that's necessarily possible. But we're definitely seeing that in the nature of protest by young people across the nation. We're doing these really big things. We're throwing paint and cans of soup at old oil paintings. I mean, we are protesting in really big ways and expecting an immediate effect and not necessarily getting that effect. I think what the Trump administration is doing right now can be seen as sort of a lesson to us that even though change is immediate right now, it's definitely going very quickly. It might not always be the kind of change that we want to see. That sometimes maybe waiting for things to slow down and taking it at a slower pace that everyone is more comfortable with can be more beneficial to the country. This is more of a personal take, but I think one of the reasons that we're seeing such a conservative resurgency right now is because we might have taken change too fast over the past 50, 60 years. We went from the civil rights movement to a very large LGBTQ inclusivity movement to, I mean, the Me Too movement and a million other changes that maybe people who were more on the conservative side weren't quite ready for. And so they pushed back in a big way, and we saw a huge conservative resurgency. Um, so I think that in general, the Trump administration is a good example. And I mean, both the rise of it and the actions right now are a good example of why we might want to step back and take change one step at a time in the way that really, really lasts, instead of in a way that might just stir the pot, and cause some more problems for our democracy, if that makes any sense.
What do you think are ways that politicians, parties, movements can do a better job appealing to young people? So, what are ways that you've talked about young people being a little frustrated and disillusioned? What are ways that young people can be brought into the fold more?
I mean, that's a difficult question because I'm thinking about, I mean, the way that you can make the quickest change has definitely been one of the leading factors in how young people vote. I think that's why a lot of young individuals did vote for President Trump. Um, I think maybe it's the assurance that you're actually doing something. One of the greatest disillusionments that I've seen young people having with the Democratic Party is that the Democratic Party is not doing anything to combat President Trump right now. They don't seem to be acting against him in a large, they don't seem to be making public statements about it. We know that work is going on behind the scenes, but we're not really seeing it being carried out into our communities. So I think the greatest way that any political party could include young people in the fold is by showing that they are actively doing work to support young people and our interests. I mean, for better or for worse.
And you don't see that happening right now.
I don't think there's as much of a focus on it. I don't think there's enough of a focus on it. And I don't think, I mean, I know that that focus is there hypothetically. I just don't know if it's being brought to young people in a way that is actually communicated to us. I think maybe one of the reasons for that is that politics right now is run by people who are 60 to 80 years old, maybe 60 to 90 years old, and they don't communicate in the same way that people who are 18 to 35 maybe do. They don't know how to effectively use social media. They don't know how to effectively use podcasts or meet young people where they're really at. I think if they communicated to young people in a way that really spoke to us about these things on that level, that they're doing things to engage young people and to support our interests, if they focus more on that, they might see more engagement with young people.
You on that point, I feel like something I've heard in classes and talking with other young people is the importance of authenticity from leaders. And I'm curious if that resonates and what that means to you.
Yeah, I think that's definitely important. That is something that I look for in anyone that I vote for, is that they're actually going to do what they say they're doing. I want to know that they're a good person, and that's definitely a little bit naive. But I think generally when young people are looking at their leaders, they want to know in some sense that the person that they're voting for is the kind of person that they want to see in office. And I think that's one of the major reasons why young people are so disillusioned with politics right now. It's because we see someone that we think is a good person and we find out that maybe they don't represent our interests as well as we once thought. that also I think might be one of the reasons why so many young people voted for President Trump is because, okay, maybe he's not the best guy, but at least we know what we're getting. Um, so on that note, maybe it's not authenticity so much as actual honesty from politicians that we're looking for. I don't know how to fix the issue because I think there's such a lack of trust between young people and politicians right now that even if a politician came out saying, "Look, I'm honest, you know what you're getting, I haven't done anything bad, you can trust me," young people would laugh them off the stage.
Do you think that some of the actions of the 24 campaign from the Democrats too contributed to that lack of trust?
I think so. I really do think so. There was so much turmoil in the Democratic Party that I think, and so much, I mean, not turmoil between Democratic voters in the Democratic Party, but within the elites of the Democratic Party itself, that it kind of made people feel as though they didn't have much say in the matter and that their interests were not actually represented by the Democratic Party. From as soon on as and when the Democratic Party launched its campaign for Biden, I was hearing people say that Biden should not be the nominee. I was hearing people push against that, and that was not represented until much, much later when the what you might say is the elites of the Democratic Party decided for the voters that that was not the best idea. Um, I think people felt as though they could not trust the Democratic Party when it seemed as though it was so far from them, if that makes any sense.
How do we get more, I mean, people, but young people in general, how do we get them into a place where they are listening to each other more?
I think the major place where that starts is education, not higher education, but in elementary school, in middle school, in high school, in places that, I mean, 99% of young people are located. We need to teach young people that listening to each other in classes is important, and then they can carry that into their everyday life. That's something that I was very fortunate to learn, and that's something that shaped in a great part who I am today and my my passion for listening to people on other sides of political issues than I. Um, I was going to say something else, and I'm kind of forgetting what it was. I think we can carry this into
Very good.
colleges as well, with things like the Hopkins Political Union or chapters of Ideal, which we also have on campus. There are several other organizations that Professor Binder mentioned in the last chapter of the Channels of Student Activism, which I found really interesting. Um, but I think it starts very early on. And if we invest into our communities and into education, um, education will teach us the kind of critical thinking skills that are necessary for carrying on this kind of conversation, approaching these conversations with empathy and openness and critical thinking. I think that's just incredibly important.
That's great. What are you most worried about right now as it comes to the pro-democracy movement and democracy in general? What are some of the biggest worries that you have?
I have so many worries. I don't think I can list them all. I guess one of the biggest ones is that the pro-democracy movement is so tied to the Democratic Party, and for that reason is seen by a lot of people as elitist, as comprised of only educated individuals, as not the most inclusive of them, as a partisan affair. That is a huge concern to me. Because if we want the pro-democracy movement to really take hold and to be able to do the great things that we know it can, we need it to reach every person. We need to be at least have the capacity to reach every person. And if people are seeing it in this light, I mean, that can't happen. One of the greatest concerns for me in that way is people in the pro-democracy movement maybe looking at others who are not as pro-democracy and saying, oh, they're not that way because they're not educated. Um, I think that just reinforces some of the beliefs that people who might not be as pro-democracy or included in the pro-democracy movement have about how the pro-democracy movement advocates for democracy. If
Can
that makes
you,
sense.
is it, yeah. That last point, looking at people that aren't part of pro-democracy community and seeing that is not educated, can you speak a little bit more to how that manifests or what you mean by that? Is it's a sort of like a, oh, well, only someone that's not educated could actually be supportive of someone like Trump, or how do you see that come across when you're saying that they're not as tolerant to folks with different levels of education, I guess, or saying that more education would lead to different viewpoints?
I mean, how, like, where do I see this? Where do I see people saying this kind of thing or
Yeah, or yeah,
politically?
yeah.
Um, I mean, I see people saying this thing in anywhere from classes to the political union conversations to personal conversations. I think when you have had the privilege of a whole lot of education of democracy, you can you can see other people who might not have had the privilege of the same education as not being as aware. Um, and maybe miss some of the points that their opinions can provide a completely different perspective and shed a light on the problems with our democracy that you might not be able to recognize because you are in that privileged position of being able to have so much education. And I think the way that this is received by people who may not have had the privilege of higher education or may not have wanted to attend higher education institutions is condescending. I don't think anyone wants to be condescended to. I think people feel condescended to by their politicians and by the pro-democracy movement, and for that reason, do not want to engage with it and do not want to support it. I think it's a really huge issue.
That no, I appreciate that. And so and do you feel like young people feel like does that happen at points with young people where there is this sort of condescension that happens of you need to vote or participate a certain way?
Definitely. Thank you for making that connection. That's something I've seen. I mean, in talking to people about my own political beliefs, I mentioned in class a little bit that my family does not share the same political beliefs as me. My entire family is quite left-leaning, pretty far left, and I would consider myself more moderate, a little bit more in the center of the political spectrum. And when I mentioned some of my political beliefs to my family, one of the major things that I hear, one of the things I hear most often from my family is, "Oh, you're naive. Don't worry, you'll grow up and you'll grow out of that. Um, Going to college will change your opinion. You'll settle a little bit more in your political identity, and you won't believe the same way that you do now." The way I received that was not well. And I can understand a little bit more where other people are coming from when people tell them that education is going to change their beliefs in some way. I think that this is something that a lot of young people experience in their communities. People telling them that when they go to college, their beliefs will change. People telling them that when they grow up, their beliefs will change. And I think this is also one of the major things that we see in how young pro-democracy advocates are treated by either side of the aisle. That because of their age, they don't necessarily have the life experiences to decide on what they want to advocate for, that they don't know how best to advocate for what they want, and that maybe they shouldn't be involved in these movements because they're simply too young to understand. I think that that's quite dangerous. Young people approach these issues with the kind of fresh eyes and with the kind of awareness that older folks who've been involved in the movement for longer just may not have. And not to say that's bad or anything. I mean, there's a place for everyone in the pro-democracy movement, but this leads to young people who are quite literally the future of the world not feeling valued in the same type of way and contributes to them perhaps not engaging as much later in life because they still don't feel as valued in that democracy. I mean, again, I want to emphasize the importance of young people voting. I think that because we have grown so cynical, we are not registering to vote and voting the same ways. No matter how bad things seem to be getting, I think that is just so important to show up at the ballot box, cast your vote. Um, Even if you think there's a chance you might not be voting for the right person, the person best represents your interests, just to cast your ballot, show your voice, show up in any way that you think you can or that you want to. If maybe you don't have your citizenship or you're not able to vote yet, you're too young to vote, showing up in the way that you're able to by protesting, by writing a letter to the editor, by calling into your local politician, by researching some of the things that you care about, by talking to other people, showing up, voting, doing what you can. It's just so important.